If you look at a map of Southeast Asia, Vietnam looks like a fragile accident, a thin, precarious S draped along the edge of the South China Sea. It is a country that, by every law of geopolitical gravity, should have been swallowed whole centuries ago. It sits in the shadow of a giant to the north and was carved up by empires from the west. Yet here is the paradox that haunts historians. Vietnam is not a story of a people who were conquered. It is the story of a people who specialized in the art of the unbendable. While other civilizations folded or faded into the background of greater empires, the Vietnamese developed a strange, almost biological resistance to being erased. This isn't just a history of a nation-state. It is a 2,000-year-old insurgent movement that eventually decided to become a country. We are told that history is written by the victors, but in this corner of the world, history was written by those who simply refused to lose. The geography of this land is its first and most demanding character. Imagine a carrying pole with two heavy baskets of rice balanced at either end. To the north, the Red River Delta, the cradle, the ancestral home, humid and prone to violent flooding. To the south, the sprawling, silt-heavy Mekong Delta. Connecting them is a spine of rugged, unforgiving mountains and a coastline that offers no place to hide. This terrain didn't just provide food, it dictated a lifestyle of constant, grueling labor. To survive the Red River, you had to build dikes. To build dikes, you had to organize. To organize, you had to submit to a collective will. From the very beginning, the Vietnamese identity was forged in the mud of the paddy field and the spray of the sea. It was a geography that bred a specific kind of person, patient, communal, and intensely protective of the village gate, that symbolic barrier where the king's law supposedly stopped and the people's traditions began. It was a perfect fortress, provided you were willing to die for every inch of it. But then, the world arrived to test that resolve. For a long time, legend tells of the Hung kings and a golden age of bronze drums and early sovereignty, a time when the identity was being quietly baked in the tropical sun. But in 111 BC, the Han dynasty of China looked south and saw not a neighbor, but a province. They moved in, and for the next 1,000 years the map simply called this place Annam, the pacified south. The disruption was total. The Chinese brought their writing, their bureaucracy, their philosophy, and their taxes. They intended to turn the Vietnamese into southern Chinese. This is the moment where most cultures would have dissolved. But here is the first great irony. The Vietnamese didn't reject Chinese culture. They weaponized it. They learned the invader's language to argue with his officials. They adopted his military tactics to eventually defeat his generals. They took the golden chains of Confucianism and used them to bind their own villages together into a fist. By the time the year 938 AD rolled around, the tension had reached a breaking point. At the Battle of Bach Dang River, a commander named Ngo Quyen didn't use a massive fleet to win. He used the tide. He drove iron-tipped stakes into the riverbed, invisible at high tide, and lured the massive Chinese fleet into a trap. As the tide receded, the great empire's ships were impaled on the very land they sought to conquer. It was a masterclass in the Vietnamese way, using the environment as an extension of the soul. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a resurrection. After a millennium of occupation, the pacified South stood up and called itself Dai Viet. But don't mistake this for a peaceful ending. This was just the beginning of a cycle where survival became the only measurable currency. The following centuries were a frantic, bloody expansion known as the Nam Tien, or the March to the South. As the Vietnamese pushed down the coast, they weren't just growing. They were consuming the Champa Kingdom and the fringes of the Khmer Empire, transforming from a northern river culture into the elongated S we see today. But as the land grew, the center could not hold. By the 1600s, the country was a house divided, the Tring lords in the north and the Nguyen lords in the south, separated by a physical and ideological wall near what would later become the tragic 17th parallel. It is a haunting echo of a division that would return centuries later with much deadlier consequences. Imagine a farmer in central Vietnam during this era, caught between two warring dynasties, his home burned by one army today and looted by another tomorrow. For him, the nation was a distant, terrifying concept, The only reality was the rice in his bowl and the hope that the monsoon would be kind. Then came the cross and the coin. In the mid-19th century, France arrived, not with the intention of assimilation like the Chinese, but with the cold, calculated logic of extraction. They wanted rubber, coal, and civilization. They saw a backward kingdom and replaced it with a plantation economy. This is where we must zoom in to see the true cost. Imagine the Michelin rubber plantations in the 1920s. Thousands of Vietnamese coolies working in malaria-ridden forests, their lives valued less than the sap dripping from the trees. If you tried to run, you were hunted. If you stayed, you died of exhaustion. The French built beautiful opera houses in Hanoi and wide boulevards in Saigon, but the foundations were laid on the backs of a peasantry that was being pushed to the brink of extinction. The art of the unbendable was being tested by a modern industrial power that didn't just want the land, it wanted the profit. The pivot point of 1945 did not begin with a glorious parade. It began with the shape of a skeleton. A horrific famine, pushed to its absolute limit by the Japanese occupation and French neglect, had claimed the lives of nearly 2 million people. Imagine the streets of Hanoi littered with those who had simply run out of life, while granaries remained under the heavy guard of foreign soldiers. It was in this crucible of total despair that a thin, frail man, weathered by years of labor and illness but possessed of an unshakable will, stepped onto the stage of history. That man was Ho Chi Minh. He did not emerge from a vacuum. He was the result of a 30-year odyssey across continents. From the kitchens of London and the gardens of Paris to the crowded streets of New York and Moscow, he wasn't just seeking a living, he was searching for a key. He watched how the West spoke of liberty while maintaining empires, and he realized that if Vietnam were to survive, it would have to seize its own place using the very language of the modern world. On September 2, 1945, at Ba Dinh Square, before a sea of thousands, Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence, officially founding the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In a strategic masterstroke that stunned the world, he cited the immortal words of the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This was no hollow imitation. It was a sharp, calculated message to the Allied powers that the Vietnamese claim to freedom was as sacred and legitimate as that of any nation on earth. Yet, the irony of history carries a bitter sting. Even as these hopeful words echoed through the heart of Hanoi, the victors of World War II were meeting at the Potsdam Conference, secretly carving up the fate of this land on a political map where the Vietnamese were never invited to sit. After a millennium of resisting the North and a century of confronting the West, this nation found itself once again a pawn on a Cold War chessboard, a game they did not design, but one they would be forced to play with their own blood and tears just to stay alive. What followed was a 30-year war that defied every rule of modern physics. How does a pre-industrial nation defeat the two greatest military powers of the 20th century? The answer isn't found in a textbook. It's found in the tunnels of Ho Chi Minh. Zoom in. Imagine a space so narrow your shoulders touch the dirt, 30 feet underground, while B-52 bombers turn the surface into a moonscape. People lived there. They birthed children there. They repaired radios and cooked meals there, venting the smoke through hidden holes hundreds of yards away. This was the unbendable spirit taken to its literal subterranean extreme. The American military saw a target-rich environment. The Vietnamese saw a holy war for the right to simply exist without permission. It was a conflict where the Goliath had the watches, but the David had the time. When the tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon in April 1975, the world thought the story was over. But for the average Vietnamese person, the victory felt a lot like a funeral. The country was unified, yes, but it was also a charred ruin, isolated by sanctions and burdened by a rigid, failing command economy. The 1980s were the dark years. This is the psychological insight we often miss. After winning the war, Vietnam nearly lost the peace. People who had survived napalm were now starving because of bureaucracy. The government had tried to force the collective will onto the economy, and the result was hyperinflation and empty shelves. A nation that had fought for sovereignty found itself begging for rice. Then came 1986, the Doi Moi reforms. In a stunning pivot that mirrored their ancestors' ability to adapt, the communist leadership embraced the market. They didn't do it because they loved capitalism. They did it because the alternative was disappearance. It was another survival tactic. Vietnam opened its doors and the world rushed in. But this time they didn't come with bayonets. They came with factory contracts and tourist visas. The transformation has been dizzying. Today, the children of those who lived in tunnels are building high-tech hubs for Samsung and Intel. The skylines of Ho Chi Minh City and Da Nang look more like New York or Singapore than the war-torn images that still linger in the Western imagination. But look closer, past the neon lights and the bustling Starbucks in Hanoi. The cost of this progress is etched into the social fabric. There is a profound tension between the old guard, who remember the hunger and the sacrifice, and a Gen Z population that views the American war as a distant black and white movie. The state remains a one-party system, tightly controlled, yet the society is vibrating with an entrepreneurial energy that is almost impossible to contain. The small size versus unbendable will paradox has evolved. Vietnam is now navigating the treacherous waters between a rising China and a wary West, playing a sophisticated game of bamboo diplomacy, bending with the wind so as not to break, but always keeping its roots firmly in the same soil. As we stand in the modern nation-state of Vietnam, we are looking at a survivor that has refused to become a ghost. It is a country that has been colonized, divided, bombed, starved, and sanctioned, and yet it has emerged as one of the most dynamic economies on the planet. But there is a haunting question that remains. In the rush toward the future, what happens to the soul that was forged in the resistance? If you walk through the quiet, misty hills of the north, or the neon-soaked streets of the south, you realize that Vietnam's history isn't a straight line. It's a circle. It is a constant process of breaking down and rebuilding, of absorbing the world and then reshaping it. The story of Vietnam teaches us that a nation isn't just a border on a map. It's a shared memory of refusal. It's the realization that you can burn the house down, but as long as the foundation remains, the family will return. The world may look at Vietnam and see a success story of the 21st century, but if you listen to the silence in the rice paddies at dusk, you'll hear the echo of a much older truth. They are still here, not because they were the strongest or the richest or the most technologically advanced, but because when the world told them to vanish, they simply looked the world in the eye and said, "Not today." And in the end, perhaps that is the only victory that actually matters.